Hello, this is Nicole Mashburn, and this is going to be one of your anatomy videos. And the way we do the anatomy videos, the lab videos, is we have a PowerPoint version and we also have a model version where Miss Graham is standing in the lab and describing things to you while she demonstrates it on the actual models. So between these two videos, you should be able to learn what you need to know for your lab portion of the exam. I've included in this PowerPoint your list of structures. Now I realize this is kind of small, but you also can download this from Blackboard. So as I talk to you about the different structures you need to know, you can go through and simply check them off your list as we discuss them. This is a picture of one of our models in our lab. We have several different types of models, and I'll try to include as many different versions as I can between the PowerPoints and your YouTube videos. One thing I want to talk about first is your anatomical terms as far as region names, direction, things like that. So you need to start becoming familiar with anatomical terms. Like when we're looking at the front of a model, we don't want to say front anymore. We want to use words like anterior and ventral. Okay? When we're looking at the back of a model, we want to use words like dorsal and posterior. You also want to make sure you understand left and right. As you're looking at the model, this is the left side of the model from the front. If you're looking at the model from the rear, this would be the left side. Okay? You also want to think about top and bottom. You want to think superior is toward the top, inferior toward the bottom. You want to talk about medial and lateral. You want to use terms medial means toward the midline, lateral toward the outside. So as I describe structures, I may say, now this is medial or lateral or inferior or superior or anterior or posterior or dorsal or ventral to another organ. So be sure you're starting to learn those terms and substituting those terms for front, back, up and down, and top and bottom. Okay? So this would be the anterior side of the model, and this would be the posterior side. So what we want to do is as we cover these models is we want to look at all the organs that we need to learn, and also think about those organs in terms of what cavity that they're found in. And so you have two main cavities. You have a dorsal cavity and a ventral cavity. So we're going to cover the dorsal cavity first, and then we'll do the ventral cavity. So the dorsal cavity it's the one that includes the cranial cavity and the spinal cavity. Okay, so this whole entire cavity is called the dorsal cavity. So you also have to realize that inside the dorsal cavity you have the cranial cavity, and then you need to know which organs are inside the cranial cavity, and that includes the brain, and we also have some cranial nerves in the pituitary gland. I'll show you that on the next slide. So this is looking kind of down into the model, the top of the head, and you can see here's the brain sitting in the cranial cavity. So the cranial cavity is part of the dorsal cavity. The spinal cavity is the cavity that's made by the vertebrae as they line up, and it's the space where the spinal cord goes. So here's a brain, and so be prepared on your exam. The models will be disarticulated. That means you may see the entire model on a picture, or you may just see organs by themselves. So make sure you're prepared to recognize an organ by its shape. So this will be the brain, and you've got some little nerves coming off of the brain. Those are your cranial nerves. This is the pituitary. Okay, this little thing right here is called the pineal gland. This little pink hair right there. So those are some things that you'll need to recognize as part of the brain, the cranial nerves, and the pituitary. This is our spinal cavity, and you can see this is your spinal cord right here, and coming off the spinal cord you have spinal nerves. All right, this is a cross section of the spinal cord. Here's your spinal cord here, and then coming off the spinal cord you have spinal nerves. So again, you might see one of these pictures and it would say name this structure, and you would say this is the spinal cord. It may say name this cavity. You would say this is the spinal cavity. This may say name this organ, and you would say brain. Alright, so that's really all there is to the dorsal cavity. The ventral cavity has more information. So the ventral cavity, I'm going to circle it, is this entire cavity. It's the whole thing on the front. This includes below your neck and all the way down to your pubic region. And so the ventral cavity includes the thoracic cavity, which is everything above the level of the diaphragm, which is your breathing muscle, and the abdominopelvic cavity here. And the abdominal pelvic cavity, if you'll notice, there's a smaller cavity here. This would be the pelvic cavity, and then all of this would be the abdominal cavity. Again, you've already seen this in some of your lecture material, so this should not be new to you. So what I want to do is focus on actually identifying the organs in these cavities. So in the thoracic cavity, we have our lungs and our heart. We have in our abdominal cavity, here's our liver, and I'm going to have some more pictures and blow this up in just a second. We have our gallbladder, this little green thing here. We have our stomach. We have part of our large intestine here. We have our small intestine. Okay, so these are all some organs that you're going to need to be able to recognize as we move through these models. You also need to think of these models in 3D, because if you look at these two pictures, you'll realize this model, all the organs are intact. And in this model, we've pulled out the lungs, the heart, the liver, the stomach, the small intestine, and we're looking at the organs that's behind that. Okay, we're looking at the organs that are behind the liver, the stomach, and the small and large intestine. So you need to think about these in 3D. In your Blackboard shell, in the Start Here page, there's an online lab guide. So you have all of these pictures, and a lot of them are labeled, and so you're welcome to print those off or download that so that you can practice labeling all your organs. All right, so let's blow it up and look at it bigger. We have a lung, and we need to make sure we know left and right. This is your left lung, and this is your right lung. And one of the ways you can know that is the right lung has 3 lobes. This is a lobe, this is a lobe, and this is a lobe. The left lobe has 2, 1, 2. It also has this cutout called the cardiac notch, so it allows the heart to beat because the heart sits a little bit to the left side. So make sure you recognize the left lung from the right lung. And then here is our heart. Okay, and we want to be able to recognize a couple of the arteries and veins that are associated with the heart. You'll learn more of these later, but we want to do a couple right now. So with our heart, the main artery that takes blood to the body, this is called the aorta, and this blue thing behind it, this is bringing blood to the heart, is called the vena cava. So I've got some more pictures. And so just to kind of go into a little more detail, again, we've removed part of the left lung in this picture. We've left the right lung. And here is our heart. So here's the aorta right here. And then bringing blood into the heart, we have our vena cava. Now, I want to talk a little bit about red and blue. Okay, what's an artery and what is a vein? An artery simply means it's taking blood away from the heart, and a vein means it's bringing blood to the heart. So in most of the body, your arteries are going to be red and your veins are going to be blue. But that's not true in the lungs. That color is telling you oxygenation. So when it's red, that means it has oxygen, and when it's blue, that means the blood does not have oxygen. And so as blood is taken out to the lungs, it needs to get oxygen. So when you see these vessels in the lungs, the red ones are actually the veins. They've gotten the oxygen and they're bringing it back to the heart. The blue ones are the arteries. So the blood has left the heart, gone out to the lung to get the oxygen, so it's blue, gets the oxygen, and returns to the heart in a vein. So in all the body, all the blue things are veins, all the red things are arteries, except in the lungs. And again, you'll learn more about this in more lectures in your second anatomy. All right. You want to think about these organs in cross-section as well. So you remember, not just from the front and the back, but you need to think about your planes. Some of the models have been cut sagittally. So remember, a sagittal cut divides you left and right. There may be a transverse cut that separates top and bottom, or there could be a coronal cut, which separates you front to back. So this would be a sagittal cut where you would be able to recognize the brain. You'd be able to recognize, this is the backbone here, okay? This would be your spinal cord coming down through the vertebral column. You'd recognize this would be the cranial cavity. So I want you guys to start thinking, you know, this is not just elementary. You need to be able to recognize these organs in several different models. Think about if you had a truck and a car, and I said, okay, find the steering wheel. You guys could all find the steering wheel in a Porsche or a Ford pickup truck. Okay, so think about it that way. These models, even though they may look different, the organs are in the same place. They have the same shape. So think about where the organ should be and what it looks like. All right, a little more information about the thoracic cavity. Okay, this is going to be your diaphragm right here. So everything above the diaphragm is the thoracic cavity. We've taken away the kind of the superficial part of the lung, and we've peeled that back so that you can see what's behind it or posterior to it. This tube here, this is the esophagus. You can also see here, this is the mouth here, so this tube here, this is the esophagus. This is how food goes down into the stomach. In front of that, or anterior to it, is the trachea. Okay, so this white tube, this with the little bumpy things, the little ridges, that's the trachea. And the trachea divides into a left and right bronchus. So the air comes down the trachea and goes into the left and right bronchus, and then out into bronchioles, and eventually into the little alveoli where the oxygen exchange occurs. So trachea becomes bronchus, becomes bronchioles. The esophagus is then posterior to that. So you see the trachea here and the esophagus here. All right, so make sure you understand, again, you have your left lung, your right lung, your esophagus and trachea are kind of behind your lungs. The trachea is anterior to the esophagus. So again, here is your esophagus and your trachea from a sagittal view. All right, so now let's move into the abdominal pelvic cavity. So remember, that's going to be everything below the diaphragm, and it's one large cavity that can be then divided into an abdominal cavity and a pelvic cavity. So what you're seeing, here's your liver, and here is your gallbladder. All right, this is going to be your stomach. This is going to be large intestine. All this gray is large intestine. I'm going to give you specific parts of that in just a minute. And then this is going to be your small intestine. All right, so now let's take these organs out, because remember, you have to look at them individually. Be prepared for these organs to be taken out of the models. So this is a view of the liver. Again, here's your gallbladder. This is a posterior view. You're looking at the back side of the liver. All right, so your gallbladder, you can tell, is on the posterior aspect of the liver. So here's your gallbladder, and then here is your liver. Now, I'm going to just tell you guys, because I think it's funny. Usually about every semester I have this picture on the test, and I know you're going to laugh, but this is what I get for the answer. I don't know why, but I get ear every semester. It's not an ear, it's a liver. Okay, and then this is the stomach. All right, so there's a lot of structures, you know, in the liver and the stomach. You do those in your second anatomy. Right now it's just general anatomy. We'll do the more specifics in your second course. All right, so now let's move into the intestines. Your intestines is broken down into your small intestine. This is your small one, and this is your large intestine, also known as your colon. Okay, and your large intestine, when you're looking at the large intestine, we name our large intestine. It has different parts based on the direction of the food. Okay, so, or the waste product. So the food's been digested in the small intestine, and now the feces and the waste is going to be carried out of the body. So the waste products are going to enter into the large intestine right here. All right, and this is called the cecum. And then it's going to travel in this direction. So this part of the colon is called the ascending colon because it's going up. This is called the transverse colon because it's going across. This is called the descending colon because it's going down. This little curvy section is called the sigmoid colon. And then this is the rectum. Now the anus is the actual exit point, so the anus is not the rectum. The rectum is the last part of the large intestine, and then the anus is the opening to the outside. So, okay, now the small intestine. The small intestine is broken up into three specific segments. You really can't see them very well on the models, okay? So when you look at the small intestine, the very first section is called the duodenum. The middle section is called the jejunum, and the last section is called the ileum. There is one of the models will show you part of the duodenum or duodenum, and I'll show you that in that slide when we get to it. So again, the first part is the duodenum, the middle part is the jejunum, and the last part is the ileum. So usually on the exam, I'll say, name this first part, or name this middle part, or name this last part. Again, there's one model that's really distinctive on the duodenum, and I'll show you that as we get to it. Now the other thing, this is a great place to point out spelling. The ileum of the small intestine is spelled I-L-E-U-M. The ilium in your hip, which is a bone, is spelled I-L-I-U-M, okay? This shows you spelling does count. One letter is a completely different part of the body. So be sure you're paying attention and spelling those structures correctly. Oh, and lastly, on the large intestine, this is the appendix down here. So this little appendage right here, that is your appendix. All right, so this is that model I said when you pull out the small and large intestine, you can see behind it. This is where you can see the duodenum. So this is that very first section of the small intestine called the duodenum. It's also known as duodenum. Either way is correct. Okay, so coming into this area on the back side of the abdominal cavity, you have your duodenum or duodenum. This pink structure here, this is the pancreas. This is the spleen. Here we have a kidney. This is our right kidney. You can see the left kidney is kind of peeking out behind. And then you have your adrenal glands, your left and right adrenal glands. So you have your duodenum, your pancreas, your spleen, and your left and right adrenal glands. You can also see this vessel here, this large vessel. This is still the aorta. The aorta is going to come out of the heart. Let me draw a little heart here. Come out of the heart, and then it's going to kind of make a U-bend and then come down. So as it goes through the thoracic cavity, we call it the thoracic aorta. And as it's in the abdominal cavity, we call it the abdominal aorta. So what you're seeing here is part of the abdominal aorta. Okay? You can also see in this model, here's our kidneys, and you see some tubes that are kind of coming down and going into the pelvic cavity. Those are our ureters. You have your right and left ureters that you can see very well on this model. This is the distal or inferior portion of the esophagus. So this is where the esophagus would go into the stomach. So this is actually the esophagus right here. You can see some ribs. You can see there's a vein. It's blue. Here's another vein. This is an artery, this red thing. So down here you can see some nerves coming off of the spinal cord. So lots of things that you can see on these models. And so be prepared when you see pictures like this that I can ask you questions about what you're looking at. This is a slightly different view. This would be one of your kidneys, again your adrenal gland. This is the duodenum right here, and here's your pancreas. And I like this view because this is showing you your inferior vena cava. Okay? So if you think about your heart, I'm going to draw a little heart here. The vena cava is what brings blood back to the heart. Well, it comes in to the top of the heart. It kind of comes in like that. So you have a superior and an inferior vena cava. So the superior vena cava drains the head and the arms, and the inferior vena cava drains the lower thorax, abdomen, and the legs. And so when you see that large vein that's parallel to the aorta in the abdominal cavity, that's part of your inferior vena cava. And again, you're going to have way more information about that in your second level of anatomy. But right now, you should recognize your abdominal aorta and your inferior vena cava. All right, so now if you look into the abdominal cavity, abdominal pelvic cavity, and then separate out, this is the pelvic cavity. So it's a separate little cavity within the abdominal pelvic cavity, and this would be your urinary bladder. So here come your ureters coming down from your kidneys, and they're going to go into the bladder. All right. There's really not anything. I've kind of already covered everything on this slide. This just gives you another chance to see it. So let's just do a quick review. I'm just going to point it out and see if you can tell me what it is. Name this structure. All right, that's the duodenum. Name this structure. That's the pancreas. Name this structure. That's the spleen. Adrenal gland, left. Adrenal gland, right. Kidney, right. Left ureter. Okay, so just test yourself as we're going through these PowerPoints and see if you recognize all the structures. All right, so now when we talk about the pelvic cavity, and we want to talk about what's in the pelvic cavity, this will delineate things between the sexes, males and females. That's where a lot of things differ between males and females, is in the pelvic cavity. So I like this model because I can remind you about planes again. So this cut, that's a transverse cut when we take someone and chop them up top to bottom. This is a sagittal cut. So we're looking at a sagittal view of the pelvic cavity. This is a female. Okay, so on the female, we have our ovary, we have our uterine tubes, and this is the uterus. So when you're looking at this model, this is going to be the uterus. A lot of people think that's the bladder, but it's not. Now let's look at this model. Again, here is the ovary and the uterine tube, and you're seeing the uterus right here. So where is the bladder? The bladder is below the uterus, okay, or inferior to the uterus in the female. So in this sagittal cut, we have our ovary and our uterine tubes, or fallopian tubes. This would be your uterus, and this would be your bladder, okay? This would be the rectum. So we've already talked about the large intestine, so what you're seeing here is the rectum, or part of the large intestine. This exit point, this would be the anus. This tube here, this is the vagina. This is the vaginal opening. This is the urethra, the tube that goes between the bladder and the outside. So this is the urinary opening. So you have your urethral opening, your urethra, your bladder, your vagina, your uterus and your vagina with your vaginal opening, the rectum, and the anus. Okay, and remember this is a sagittal cut. You can also identify the ureters. So here comes the ureter coming down, where it will then go into the bladder. All right. All right, on the male, again, another sagittal cut. So on the sagittal cut, or this transverse cut here, we have our ureters coming down, and they're going to go, and this here now, that is the bladder. Okay, so that's not the uterus on the male. You actually can see the bladder because there's not a uterus there to cover it up. This is going to be the spermatic cord going down into where the testes are hanging in these sacs, which is the scrotum, and of course this would be the penis. So here is our spermatic cord and our scrotum with our testis inside and our penis. You can also see that we have our ureter coming down here. This purple thing is the prostate gland, and this big red thing here, this is the bladder. All right, you're going to get a lot of detail and learn this in even more detail in your next anatomy. So right now, we're just going to do some basic structures. So again, we're looking at our sagittal cut. We have our ureters. We have our rectum here with our anus. The men only have 2 openings instead of 3. So on the male, here's the bladder with a long urethra, okay, going through the penis. So this long tube is the urethra, and then of course this structure is the penis, and the urethra passes through the prostate. So again, on the male, you have your bladder with no uterus. So bladder with a long urethra. Female has a bladder with a short urethra. All right, so there's some other cavities that we want to talk about. We've talked about the dorsal cavity, the ventral cavity, the thoracic cavity, and the abdominal cavity. And we actually forgot to mention one, so I need to go back. Sorry about that. I just realized I forgot to talk about a cavity. You have 2 more cavities. You have cavities inside your thoracic cavity. Around each lung, you have your pleural cavities, okay? And around your heart, you have your pericardial cavity. And then there's an area between the lungs called the mediastinum. So make sure you go back and pay attention that your lungs have a cavity and your heart has a cavity. All right, other cavities. So you have the cavity that's the space in your ear called the otic cavity. You have the nasal cavity. You have the oral cavity. And then we have our pharynx and our larynx. Okay, your pharynx is the space behind your nose and behind your mouth. So you would think of it as your throat. So that space behind your nose is called the nasopharynx. That area behind the back of your throat is called the oropharynx. This whole region is called the pharynx, and they're connected. You know, you can kind of, if you drink milk and laugh and the Coke comes out your nose or the milk comes out your nose, you know that whole cavity is connected. Your larynx is your voice box. So if you look at the front and you find your trachea, this area here, this is your larynx. And if you open up the larynx, you will see that your vocal cords are inside that. That's why we call it the voice box. So this would be your larynx on this slide. So your larynx is the upper part of the trachea. This blue thing is a vein, and this is the jugular vein right here, and this would be the carotid artery. So again, just showing you those red and blue things again. One more thing I want to talk about are the salivary glands. Whenever you see something that looks kind of orangey like this is a salivary gland. You've also got salivary glands under your tongue, so you can identify your salivary glands. You'll identify those more specifically in your next anatomy. You can also see your orbital cavity, the cavity where your eye is. So you have that cavity. And then the last organ that we need to think about is your thyroid, and it's a butterfly-shaped organ. This side's been cut away, so or you can't see it; it's hidden by the muscle. So there's your thyroid there, so you can see your thyroid gland. Again, when you're thinking about these structures, think about it in more than one model. Here again would be your nasal cavity with your nasopharynx and your oral pharynx. So this whole area is your pharynx. Down in this region here is going to be your larynx, down in front of near your trachea, and then you're going to have your esophagus here. So make sure you're thinking about again these models in more than one plane and in more than one representation. All right, and then the last thing we want to do is cover our lymph nodes and lymph vessels. So we have arteries and veins that carry blood, but there's other fluids in our bodies that need to be recycled through our body and move through our body, and that's called lymph. And so lymph has its own set of tubes, and we call these pink things, these are the lymph vessels. And associated with lymph vessels are lymph nodes. And the lymph system plays a really important role in your immune system. And so the way we name our lymph vessels and lymph nodes is based on where they're located. So this is a great way to think about those region names again. So this is up under the arm. So this is your axillary region. So these will be your axillary vessels and axillary lymph nodes. You have inguinal, so think down in your inguinal area. There's popliteal and there's cervical. So think about where in the body based on the region name. And so when a lymph vessel or lymph node is found in that region, you simply name it based on the region where you find it. Again, so here's a vein, this blue thing. You've got all these lymph vessels around it, and then all these lymph nodes. Okay. All right. So that's it for this lecture or this lab review. So take a chance. Go to your online lab guide. I'm going to write that. There's an online one. You simply open it up, and there's pictures of every model in the lab, and so you can go through. Many of them are labeled, and you can take your structures and test yourself. There's also review activities in Mastering and on Blackboard. Thank you very much.